Something is shifting among a certain type of man. Not the angry man, not the bitter man, not the man who had one bad experience and decided to punish the world for it. The clear-thinking man, the man who built something, who took his responsibilities seriously, who showed up consistently for years and paid attention to what that consistency produced in return. That man is quietly revising what he's willing to accept in a relationship. Not loudly, not with manifestos or movements or public declarations, privately, internally, with the same calm, analytical clarity he applies to every other important decision in his life. And the standards he's no longer willing to accept aren't extreme. They aren't unreasonable. They aren't the demands of a man who thinks too highly of himself. They're the basic conditions that make a relationship worth having. Conditions that used to be assumed. Conditions that previous generations of men accepted as the minimum foundation of a functioning partnership. Clear-thinking men are realizing those conditions are no longer guaranteed, and they're deciding, quietly but firmly, that a relationship without them isn't a relationship worth staying in. This is Mr. Eugene, and today we're examining 3 specific standards that this generation of accomplished, emotionally grounded men is no longer willing to compromise on. What these standards actually are, why they matter, and what it means for a relationship when they're consistently absent. Let me start by explaining who I'm actually talking about when I say clear-thinking men, because this matters for context. I'm not describing men who are avoiding relationships out of fear or immaturity. I'm not describing men who've been so damaged they can't trust anyone. I'm not describing men who have unrealistic expectations about what partnership requires. I'm describing men in their 40s and 50s who have enough life experience to have seen clearly what works and what doesn't. Men who understand that a relationship requires genuine investment from both people to function. Men who have typically already been through the experience of giving everything to a dynamic that gave very little back, and who emerged from that experience with a clearer understanding of what they actually need versus what they were conditioned to accept without question. These men are not settling. Not out of bitterness, not out of exhaustion, not out of resignation. They've simply done the honest accounting that most people avoid doing, and they've concluded that certain things are non-negotiable if a relationship is going to serve both people rather than slowly depleting one of them. Here are the 3 standards they're no longer accepting. The first standard clear-thinking men no longer accept is consistent disrespect dressed up as personality. Every man who has been in a long-term relationship has encountered this. The woman whose sharp tongue is explained away as just how she is, whose dismissiveness is framed as her being direct, whose contempt for his opinions, his choices, his contributions is presented as her being independent or strong. There's a meaningful difference between a woman who has a strong personality and genuine confidence, and a woman who consistently treats her partner with contempt and calls it character. Clear-thinking men are no longer confusing these 2 things. Disrespect in a relationship rarely announces itself as disrespect. It usually arrives wearing other labels. She's passionate, she's opinionated, she has high standards, she doesn't sugarcoat things. But underneath those labels, the actual experience for the man is something consistently corrosive. His contributions are minimized. His judgment is questioned not once in specific situations, but as a pattern, as a default assumption about his competence. His emotional expressions are mocked or dismissed. His achievements are taken for granted while his failures are cataloged and returned to regularly. A clear-thinking man who spent 20 years building genuine success does not need to accept being treated as though his judgment and contributions are fundamentally suspect. He spent 2 decades proving his competence in the most demanding arenas available. The idea that he should then come home to a relationship where his basic competence and worth are constantly questioned isn't a personality difference. It's a problem. Here's what makes this particular standard hard to enforce. Contempt in relationships is so normalized that many men have genuinely lost the ability to recognize it clearly. They've been in the dynamic long enough that the disrespect registers as background noise rather than as the serious relationship problem it actually is. A man I know spent 14 years in a marriage where his wife consistently undermined his decisions in front of the children, made dismissive comments about his career choices to their friends, and responded to his emotional expressions with variations of "you're being ridiculous." He didn't identify this as disrespect for most of those 14 years. He identified it as their dynamic, as her personality, as something he should have thicker skin about. It took someone outside the relationship reflecting back what they observed over a single dinner to help him see it clearly. When he finally did see it, he realized this had been his baseline experience of partnership for over a decade, and that at some point he had simply stopped expressing opinions, stopped making decisions confidently, and stopped sharing anything emotionally because the cost of doing so was consistently too high. Clear-thinking men are no longer accepting this. They're distinguishing between a woman who is genuinely strong and a woman who is genuinely unkind, between a woman who has high standards and a woman who reserves her respect for people and situations that have nothing to do with her partner. Respect is not optional in a functioning relationship. It's the floor. The absolute minimum foundation without which everything else built on top of it is unstable. A man can love someone and still require that she treats him with basic human dignity. These things are not in conflict. The second standard clear-thinking men no longer accept is a relationship where his needs are permanently secondary. This one runs deep because it connects to how men were raised and what they were taught their role in a relationship was supposed to be. Most men of this generation were taught, explicitly or implicitly, that their needs come last, that a man's role is to provide and accommodate, that a good man puts his partner's comfort, preferences, and emotional experience ahead of his own, that complaining about his own needs is weakness, selfishness, or failure to live up to what a real man is supposed to be. This conditioning doesn't just affect how men behave in relationships. It affects what they believe they're entitled to want. Many men in their 40s have been so thoroughly trained to subordinate their own needs that they've genuinely lost contact with what those needs even are. The clear-thinking man is recovering that contact. He's asking himself honestly, not what does she need from me, but what do I actually need from this relationship to feel like a full, valued human being inside it? And the answers he's arriving at aren't complicated or extreme. He needs to feel that his emotional experience of the relationship matters, that when he expresses something difficult, it will be received rather than deflected or weaponized, that his physical need for intimacy will be genuinely met rather than treated as an imposition or a negotiating chip, that his time and energy, the finite resources he brings to the partnership, will be treated as valuable rather than assumed to be infinitely available for others' purposes. These aren't extraordinary demands. They're the basic conditions of mutual partnership. But an enormous number of men in long-term relationships experience none of them consistently. They've accepted relationships where their emotional experience is managed rather than genuinely engaged with, where intimacy is rationed or withheld rather than freely given, where their needs are regularly deferred in favor of hers, not as a temporary accommodation in specific circumstances, but as the permanent structure of the relationship. Clear-thinking men are no longer accepting this asymmetry, not because they're unwilling to give generously, but because they understand that a relationship where one person's needs are permanently secondary to the other's is not a partnership. It's an arrangement. And most men, once they see it clearly, find they don't want to live inside an arrangement for the rest of their lives. There's a useful way to think about whether a relationship has this problem. Imagine applying the same standard to how his needs are treated as to how her needs are treated. If she expresses emotional distress, does it receive genuine, concerned engagement? If he expresses emotional distress, does it receive the same? If she expresses a need for closeness, does it get prioritized? If he expresses a need for intimacy, does it get the same priority? If her preferences about how they spend time shape the relationship significantly, do his preferences carry equal weight? In a functioning partnership, the answers to these questions should be roughly symmetrical, not identical in every instance, because relationships require flexibility and accommodation in both directions, but symmetrical in the sense that both people's needs carry genuine weight in how the relationship operates. When those answers are consistently asymmetrical, when one person's needs reliably trump the other's as a matter of structural reality rather than specific circumstances, that's not a temporary imbalance. It's the actual relationship. Clear-thinking men are seeing this clearly and deciding they're no longer willing to accept it as the permanent terms of partnership. The third standard clear-thinking men no longer accept is accountability that only flows one direction. We've talked about accountability on this channel in various forms before because it appears repeatedly as a core dynamic in relationships that are failing. But it's worth examining specifically here as one of the non-negotiable standards clear-thinking men are holding. A functioning relationship requires that both people can acknowledge their contribution to problems, take ownership of behavior that causes harm, and demonstrate genuine willingness to change. This doesn't mean perfection. It doesn't mean never making mistakes. It means that when mistakes are made, when behavior causes harm, when something needs to be addressed, there's a genuine capacity in both people to engage with that honestly. Clear-thinking men are no longer accepting relationships where this capacity exists only in them, where they are expected to acknowledge their failures clearly and change behavior genuinely, while her failures are deflected, minimized, or made somehow his responsibility. The pattern these men have observed across their own experiences and those of the men around them is remarkably consistent. He raises a concern. She deflects it. He persists. She makes it about his tone. He eventually apologizes for his frustration. Her original behavior is never addressed. The pattern continues. Or he acknowledges making a mistake genuinely and directly. She accepts the acknowledgement but adds it to a mental ledger that she returns to regularly. When she makes a mistake, she explains it, contextualizes it, and looks for his failures to balance it against rather than simply acknowledging it and owning it. The result over time is a relationship where accountability flows reliably in one direction. He is held responsible for his behavior. She is not held responsible for hers in any meaningful, consistent way. And this asymmetry, perhaps more than any other single dynamic, slowly destroys a good man's respect for both the relationship and the person he's in it with. Because here's what matters about accountability that most people miss. It's not primarily about justice or fairness in the abstract. It's about whether you can trust the person you're with, whether you can believe that what they say reflects what they actually think, whether you can rely on them to deal with difficulty honestly rather than defending themselves at the expense of reality. A person who consistently avoids accountability is a person you cannot fully trust. Not because they're necessarily dishonest in other ways, but because their self-protective deflection when confronted with their own behavior reveals that their emotional comfort takes priority over honest engagement with reality. A clear-thinking man who has spent his professional life making decisions based on reliable information understands intuitively why this matters. If the person closest to him consistently provides unreliable information about herself, her behavior, and her contribution to shared problems, he cannot make good decisions about the relationship. He's navigating with a broken compass. So he stops navigating. He withdraws to where the information is reliable, which is anywhere that isn't her. Clear-thinking men are no longer accepting this as simply how she is, or something he should develop more patience for, or challenge in communication style. They're identifying it accurately as a fundamental incompatibility with genuine partnership. And they're deciding it's a standard they're no longer willing to compromise on. Here's what I want to say directly to the men in this audience who recognize these three standards in their own relationships. Recognizing that a standard isn't being met doesn't automatically mean the relationship is over. What it means is that something needs to be addressed honestly and directly. That the conversation that's been avoided needs to happen, that the relationship deserves the clarity of someone being willing to name what's actually wrong rather than continuing to absorb it silently. That conversation requires courage. It will likely produce discomfort. She may respond defensively. She may make it about your tone or your timing. She may try to redirect it to your failures. Hold steady through all of that. Make the conversation about the specific pattern you've observed. Stay grounded in what you've actually experienced rather than getting pulled into abstract arguments about who's better or worse as a person. Be clear about what you need and why it matters. And be genuinely open to hearing her experience as well, because clarity requires that you understand the full picture, not just your own. Some relationships, when these conversations finally happen, reveal that there's genuine capacity for change, that the standard that wasn't being met was the result of dynamics that both people can shift when they're finally addressed honestly. These relationships can genuinely improve. Others reveal that the capacity for what you need genuinely isn't there, that the asymmetry is structural and the person you're with is not in a position to offer what you're identifying as non-negotiable. That information, as painful as it is ultimately more valuable than continued years of absorbing what you should have named and addressed much sooner. Clear-thinking men are no longer accepting consistent disrespect dressed as personality, no longer accepting relationships where their needs are permanently secondary, no longer accepting accountability that flows reliably in only one direction. These are not extreme standards. They are not the demands of a man who thinks too highly of himself or has unrealistic expectations of relationships. They are the basic conditions of mutual partnership, the minimum foundation required for two people to genuinely build something together rather than one person building while the other one takes. You've spent decades building what you've built. You've earned the right to apply the same clear thinking to your relationships that you've applied to everything else that matters in your life. Don't accept less than genuine partnership, not out of bitterness, not out of anger, but because you understand clearly and finally what you actually deserve. Men, which of these three standards do you recognize most clearly from your own experience? Subscribe for the honest conversations that give clear thinking men the framework to finally name what they've been living with.